All right, so I told you I was going to talk about college opportunities for meritorious students. So a co-author, Chris Avery, and I analyzed every student in the high school graduating class of 2008 who took any one of the College Board's exams or the ACT's exams, including the preliminary versions of those tests. So this is not a sample. It's the population of students who took any one of these tests. And we were really interested in low-income high achievers. And I will tell you a little bit of a story about why we got interested in the first place. It was because we were both professors at Harvard, and Harvard University's admissions office was telling us, we just can't find any low-income high achievers. They just don't apply. We need to do something to look for them, and so forth. And the president at the time, who was Larry Summers, had this sort of policy initiative to declare that every student whose family made less than $40,000 a year could go to Harvard for free. And then eventually it got raised and raised, the income limit got raised and raised. But the thing was that when we looked at the actual data, the admissions data, we looked and there were lots and lots of low-income high achievers in the data, but they didn't apply to Harvard University. So the admissions office was right that they didn't see them, but it wasn't that they didn't exist. It was that they weren't applying. And we thought, well, maybe this is a more general phenomenon. Maybe this isn't just Harvard. Maybe this is a more general phenomenon. So that's kind of how we got interested in this topic. So we're talking here about low-income high achievers, so family income. So this is in 2008, I should be clear, since we're talking about that group of students, because we want to follow them for a long time. Their family incomes were at or below about $40,000. They were in the top 10% on the SAT or the ACT. They had a high school GPA of A- or higher, although that's not much of a cut once you've got the top 10%. And the number of students we were told we would be able to find was about 4,000, and in fact, we found 35,000 in the data, okay? So there were just a lot more than anyone thought were available. So they were just lots and lots of students who didn't apply anywhere, and that's what really got us interested. All right, so let's look at what high-income students do when they apply to college. This may remind you of yourself. It's about sophisticated students, and not necessarily just about high-income students, but these are high-income students, so they're in the top quarter of the income distribution. And you often hear when you're applying to college that there are safety schools, right? There are schools that some people call peer school. I like peer schools. Some people call them match schools. Okay, there's schools where your scores and grades tend to match those of the students who are there. And then there are reach schools where the average student may have slightly better scores or grades than you do, so it's a bit of a reach for you to get in. Okay, so those three categories, everyone's heard of those: safety, peer, or peer, match, and reach. Okay, all right. So, and you'll notice here that what I've done is I put the college's selectivity on the horizontal axis, measured as the college's median SAT score minus the student's SAT score in percentiles. So let's just look at the place where it's 0 for right now. That means, if we're at 0, that means that the college's median SAT score matches my SAT score as an applicant, okay? So I'm just applying to a school where I'm exactly the median, I would be exactly the median student. If it's plus 10, that's a school where the median student is 10 percentiles above me in the distribution. So maybe I'm at the 80th percentile, but the median student is at the 90th percentile, okay? Minus 10 is the other way around. I'm at the 80th percentile, the median student's at the 70th percentile. And if we go all the way down to minus 100, that's just kind of what I use for the non-selective schools, okay? So all the non-selective schools are sort of put there because we really don't even know what their median student score is, since students don't have to take tests to go to those schools. Okay, so the pink thing, the pink sort of bar on the far left are the non-selective schools, and then you can see that I'm showing you the safety range, the peer range, and the reach range for these students. And remember, we're only talking about high-achieving students here. So these are all high-achieving students, high-income high-achieving students. So you'll notice that what the high-income students do is they mainly apply to safety, peer, and reach schools. Some of them apply to schools that are a little bit lower than safety. Those are usually their state universities, because not all state universities actually even make it into the safety range, okay? Because there are some state universities not very selective at all. But for the most part, high-income students sort of use the strategy that most admissions counselors or most guidance counselors would suggest. Apply to a range of safety, peer, and reach schools. And they do apply occasionally to non-selective schools, but those tend to be very specific. Like, they're usually art schools or culinary schools or something like that. They're not just applying to their, local community college or something like that. They're usually applying to something very specific. Okay, now let's look at low-income students' portfolios of college applications. And you'll notice, first of all, that the bulk of low-income students, these are all high achievers. Remember, they're all above the 90th percentile in terms of the SAT and the ACT. The bulk of them are just applying only to non-selective schools. And many of them apply only to one non-selective school, okay? So they're not even giving themselves a choice or a portfolio, realistically. They just apply to the local non-selective school, whether it's a 2-year or a 4-year school. And there are some of them who apply to safety, peer, and reach schools. What we're going to see, so you can see there's some, the bars over there, they're not zero, okay? There are some students who are actually applying to those schools. About 8% of them exhibit behavior that looks a lot like that of the high-income students. So about 8% of the low-income students who are high achievers act just like their high-income students who are high achievers, but the vast majority of them do not act like them, okay? All right, so now let's try to figure out why. I'm going to give you some possible explanations and try to eliminate some of them for you, and then focus you on the ones that we think are the most important. First, I'm going to show you it's not the prohibitive cost of selective colleges. Then I'm going to, I'll just tell you that low-income high achievers who apply are, they might say, well, I'm not going to be admitted. Or maybe if I go to one of those selective colleges, I won't thrive because I'm from a low-income background or something like that. That turns out to not be true. The third explanation is that selective colleges could easily recruit low-income high achievers, so they just aren't trying. Maybe they don't even really want them to come, so they're not trying hard to recruit them. Explanation number 4 is that existing counselors or teachers could easily guide low-income high achievers, so they're just not giving it a shot, okay? That turns out to not be true either. And then we're left with 2 explanations. One is that for cultural reasons, low-income high achievers just don't want to attend selective colleges or peer colleges. Or the other could just be that the students need better information. Now, it's going to be impossible, really, to test explanation number 5, okay? Because that's kind of like going up to someone and saying, hey, tell me about your cultural preferences or something like that. Economists don't really do that kind of thing. So maybe psychologists do, but anyway, we don't. Well, we can test explanation number 6 with an experiment where we're going to give students better information. Okay, so that one we can test. All right, so let's first look at this question of the cost of going to a more selective college. So first look at the sort of light blue bars. Okay, that shows you the comprehensive cost of different types of colleges. And you'll notice that the higher up you are on this chart, the more selective the college is. So these are actually Barron's rankings of colleges and universities in the United States. It starts with most competitive at the top, then highly competitive plus, then highly competitive, very competitive plus, very competitive. You notice Barron's thinks everybody's competitive. Competitive plus, competitive, less competitive, no selection, and then there are the 2-year colleges, private 2 years, public 2 years, and for-profit 2 years. Okay, so if we just look at the blue bars, which are comprehensive costs, so what's comprehensive cost? It's tuition, fees, room, and board. It's all the stuff that you pay for. Okay, that's comprehensive cost. You'll notice that the more selective the college is, in general, the higher the comprehensive costs. So the highest comprehensive costs here are at the most competitive schools. And generally, as you go down in terms of the selectivity of the school, the comprehensive cost goes down, with the notable exception that for-profit 2-year colleges are actually considerably more expensive than other 2-year colleges. They are actually quite expensive colleges, and in fact, they are as expensive as less competitive 4-year colleges. Okay, so that's the comprehensive cost. So that goes down as you go to a less competitive college. But now let's look at the out-of-pocket cost for a student who is in the bottom quarter of the income distribution. Those are the sort of navy blue bars. okay? And you'll notice that actually the lowest cost for going, if you are in the bottom 25% of the income distribution, is at the most competitive colleges, okay? Why? It's because these colleges are rich, or they get big subsidies from their state legislatures, okay? So they have very subsidized costs. So if you are, now if you're a high income student, you're not necessarily gonna get all that much financial aid, but if you are a low income student, it is the cheapest place to go. It is not the most expensive place to go. Now that doesn't mean no low income students necessarily understand that, right? But it actually is the case that they are the cheapest places to go because they can afford to give the most financial aid. And just in general, when you look at the navy blue bars, you can see that it's fairly complicated. It isn't something simple where you would say like, oh, the more competitive the college, the more I'm going to pay. It's not that simple, okay? It's actually kind of, there's a lot of action there. We can talk about that later. But in any case, for the low-income high achievers, one thing is very clear. It is that if they knew about what they would actually have to pay, they would not be afraid to apply to these schools because of what they would pay, because they're going to pay the least. Okay? So I kind of showed you that. So what happens when these low-income high achievers actually apply to very competitive colleges? They're just as likely to be admitted as high-income students with the same test scores and grades. It doesn't actually appear in the data that we have that they were, at the time, given much of an advantage in admissions. I think that may be a little different today because people are much more aware of this issue. But at the time, they were just admitted as though they had the same, just like anyone else with the same test scores and grades. They made just as much progress towards their degree at the same rate, and they graduated on time at the same pace as high-income students, so people from the top quarter of the income distribution who had the same test scores and grades and who attended the same institution. So it wasn't like they were at some terrible disadvantage once they got to college. And if they went to a non-selective institution, even though you might say, oh, they should just breeze through it and they should do really well and graduate really fast, and maybe they can graduate even ahead of time or something like that. In fact, their graduation rates are quite low, okay? And they have graduation rates that look a lot more like those of their classmates, many of whom are not particularly high achievers, than they look like those of high achievers who go to more selective institutions. So even though it's a less demanding atmosphere in some ways, they are less likely to graduate on time. So who are these students who are able to get in, who wouldn't have to pay that much, okay, but who simply do not apply to selective institutions? Well, what we came up with was a hypothesis that was based on the data that we started looking at Harvard, but then went on to look at, the data for the entire United States. And we call them the one-offs, all right? So there are certain high schools in the United States where there are actually quite a few low-income high achievers, but they tend to be fairly specific schools. So for instance, selective high schools, where you have to take an exam to go to the high school. So they're there, but there's a huge cluster of high achievers. They're not all low income. Magnet schools, like Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, if you are aware of that school, or Lowell in San Francisco. Traditional feeder schools, these are schools that just have had a long tradition of sending high achievers to certain colleges. Schools that happen to be near a college, like the New Haven public schools, happen to be right next to Yale, so it turns out that they send a supply of low-income high achievers to Yale University. Schools in the very biggest cities in the United States, and by this I do not mean like Toledo, Ohio. I'm talking about big cities, okay, like Los Angeles, Chicago, et cetera, New York, and certain mentoring programs in the United States. So Stuyvesant, has anybody ever heard of the school Stuyvesant in New York City? Yeah, okay, so Stuyvesant's a very, very selective school, right? You have to take an exam, and in fact, Stuyvesant is arguably more selective than any college or university in the United States. That's how selective Stuyvesant is, okay? So Stuyvesant alone accounts for 363 out of the approximately 4,000 low-income high achievers who apply to very selective colleges and universities. Stuyvesant alone. Because basically, if you go to Stuyvesant and you're a low-income student, you know how the system works, right? You're around all these other very high achievers. They're all applying to these very selective colleges and universities. All your college counselors and your high school teachers know what's going on. Okay, Stuyvesant and the other big exam schools in New York account for a large number of these low-income high achievers. But the remaining low-income high achievers are not like that. They're not in high schools like that, okay? They're just in high schools where they happen to be the one low-income high achiever. That's it. There's no one there to tell them, this is how you do it, this is how it works, we're gonna get you all prepped up. They just happen to be a student who is a very high achiever in a high school that maybe has only one very high achiever every 2 or 3 years, okay? Maybe once every 4 years or 5 years, okay? So it's not even like there's a stream of peers who could say, oh, I did this last year, you do it this year, I'm gonna tell you all about how to do it. There wouldn't necessarily be anyone like that in their high school. So we call them the one-offs, okay? So this is a map of the United States, obviously. What it's showing you is the density of low-income high achievers, and I've picked out a lot of the places where we're going to end up having done our experiment. But the point of this map is very simple, so the little black dots show you where we're going to do our experiment. Low-income high achievers are everywhere across the United States. Okay, there are no parts of the United States apart from places like where no one lives, like deserts of Nevada. Okay, there are no places in the United States where there are not low-income high achievers. They're just kind of spread fairly randomly throughout the United States. But if we want to look at low-income high achievers who apply to selective colleges, I told you this is a minority of the students, only about 8% of them, they come from just a few places. In fact, 70% of them come from just 15 out of the 316 metropolitan areas in the United States: San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, San Diego, Dallas, Houston, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Portland, Boston, Providence, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. So once you've taken account of those 15 metropolitan areas, that's it, okay? The rest of them are very, very unlikely to apply to a selective college or university. So there are a lot more sort of these one-offs than there are of the kids who go to Stuyvesant and know how the system works. So this is also why when we looked at maps like this, we thought to ourselves, information has to be part of the problem. Because there's some kids who seem to be in a cluster where they must be very well informed about how to do this, and other kids, they're just the only kid in their high school who's like this, and they maybe don't realize that they could go to a very selective college and it wouldn't cost them very much money. Okay, so let's do 2 more things, because I told you that I don't think we should blame it on counselors or teachers or things like that. Let's do a recruiting thought experiment. Suppose that colleges send an admission staff member to any high school that has 20 or more high achievers. So 92% of high-income high achievers will end up talking to a college staff member, 66% of low-income high achievers who already apply, but only 17% of low-income high achievers who do not already apply. So they're basically just a little bit too dispersed for the colleges to send recruiting staff there. Whoops, went in the wrong direction. So also, let's do a little counselor thought experiment. Suppose that a counselor has expertise if he or she attended a peer college himself, like a selective college, or if at least 5% of his or her, typically 400 students, that's how many students counselors have in the United States, are high achievers. So this virtually all high-income high achievers and low-income high achievers who already apply would end up having a counselor who was pretty knowledgeable, but no low-income high achievers who do not already apply would have a counselor who was knowledgeable given this thought experiment. Okay, so those are the key conclusions. Let me just run through them quickly because now I want to talk about our experiment. Most low-income high achievers don't apply to any selective college. The ones who do apply enroll and graduate just like high-income high achievers with similar GPAs. The ones who do not apply have dramatically worse outcomes. The ones who do apply typically come from these central cities with these very specific schools. And the low-income high achievers who do not apply are insufficiently geographically concentrated to be reached by, say, admission staff visits or campus visits or something like that. And interventions that are likely to affect them should not depend for effectiveness, on whether the students are concentrated in schools. So I can't have an intervention to help them that says, oh, I have to hold a bunch of them together, because they're not. A bunch of them are not together.